Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. It is very early in the morning, but we have an important topic to talk about today. So thank you for your presence, and gentlemen, thank you for your service, because we are talking about Afghanistan. And obviously, because the time is short for such a topic, I'm going to start just with a brief introduction with saying that I'm very grateful and honored to moderate this distinguished guest panel. And I really mean it. Thank you for traveling during the pandemic to be with us and to share your thoughts on not only this topic. So we have here today Mr. Harlan Ullman, an author, a strategic thinker, someone who has focused on national security strategy for the U.S. for more than 3 decades and still serves the country.
George Washington.
George Washington.
You know who he was.
Of course, of course. I remember about that. Obviously, Mr. Sir James Everard, who has also served in NATO and with the UK, of course, but within NATO, and still serves NATO strategic visions and help us understand what's the role for us today as an alliance. Mr. Charles Powell, who is the representative of the main Spanish think tank on international relations, who is a friend of the Strategic Center. Thank you for being with us again. Ambassador Pierre Andrieu from France, former ambassador to Tajikistan, but also to the Republic of Moldova, and from what I remember from the biography, also a co-chair on Nagorno-Karabakh Minsk group, sorry. I'm a bit nervous and also early morning nervousness. And from Turkey, I'm Mr. Yeşiltaş. I hope I am correctly saying your name. From a think tank on international affairs and socioeconomic research, who is probably going to give us a Turkish view on the situation in Afghanistan. With that, and with no further ado, our main question today is what happens next, and what is Afghanistan, the fall of Afghanistan, quote unquote, telling us about the future of NATO and the EU. And I will start with Mr. Harlan Ullman, asking him about his vision on the U.S., because obviously, as we are looking at the news here in Europe, it appears that the U.S. kind of suffered a loss in credibility, and there is the question marks of how much are we going to count on the U.S. within the alliance and outside it, for those that have basically been under the U.S. security umbrella, let's say, as a metaphor. So the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Turn your thing on. Well, good morning, and thank you very much. And I want to congratulate again the NSC for putting together this rather good conference. Let me be very, very provocative. Afghanistan is now a non-issue in the United States, period. It will still fester. Republicans will use it to hit Joe Biden over the head. If you read the polls, 2/3 of Americans support leaving. They were not very happy the way it happened. And interestingly enough, and this is domestic politics, so you may be bored with it, the idiot Republicans in Texas rode to the rescue of Joe Biden by passing this imbecilic law about abortion. Now, unfortunately, abortion is a huge issue in the United States. But what they have done is to infuriate every single woman in the country, Republicans and Democrats. And I would venture to say that the Republicans will do far worse in 22 because of this. Then Hurricane Ida, which was the biggest rainfall in 500 years, completely obliterated Afghanistan from the headlines. And in America, something lasts one news cycle and is going to be replaced, and something else will happen. Donald Trump will be indicted, he'll go to jail, there'll be some other huge event. So I think as a political issue, even though it will fester, Afghanistan is going to have far less relevance. Second, there's no other place for our allies to go. America's not leaving. Joe Biden is an internationalist. He's dedicated to NATO, and I think we're making too much ado about that. Third, the real issue, and it was my column for this week, the Taliban will be unable, and I'm speaking with authority that I don't have, but I would venture to say the Taliban will be incapable of governing Afghanistan, period. What do we do then? And that is the question. I think, and I would recommend to the U.S. government, that whatever they do, it's got to be subtle. It's got to go through other organizations like the UN. But this is going to be a humanitarian nightmare. And one of the problems will be a conflict between the political wing of the Taliban, led by Mr. Baradar, and the military wing, which is really headed by no one. And that's going to be, unfortunately, a huge conflict. Unfortunately, when I went to Afghanistan the first time in 2003 with General Jim Jones, who was then Supreme Allied Commander Europe and nominally in charge, it struck me that the war in Afghanistan was unwinnable. And the same problems we saw today have not been corrected after all the money and all the time and all the courage of the Afghan security forces, who have been given a very bad rap because it was us who collapsed them. And that will be the issue, but it's going to be more like Yemen. It's going to be more of a humanitarian tragedy. And I think the neighboring countries will do their best to get as far away as they can from the contamination. I don't see China or Russia exploiting this. Pakistan is so screwed up, and Imran Khan is just beyond the pale. One really hopes that the military would take over, but that's not going to happen. And so I think there's going to be maybe less instability than one would think, because it's in nobody's interest really to intervene. Now, that's the most optimistic picture I can have. We'll find out, however, in 4, 5, or 6 months.
Thank you very much for that view. Let's hope that the optimism will stick with us. But considering the perspective of the humanitarian crisis that you've mentioned, and the perspective of us working together under the UN, and I would say us working together within NATO, I invite Mr. Everard to share with us his thoughts about what is next, in particular with the alliance after the fall of Afghanistan, quote unquote.
Thank you. Afghanistan, hauntingly beautiful, but to quote Kim Barker from her 2011 book, The Taliban Shuffle, a country stuck somewhere between the 7th century and Las Vegas. 49 countries deployed troops to Afghanistan. I think we did many good things, but sustaining progress was despairingly difficult, excruciating expensive in blood, much of it Afghan, and treasure, most of it ours. The campaign was domestically unpopular. The local and regional dynamics were fiercely complex. And in the end, we lacked patience, staying power, and after 2 decades, understanding. Primarily because in Afghanistan, what is true today is often not true tomorrow. We left because the alternative, particularly without the US, was more and more fighting, more and more money, and an open-ended NATO military presence. And there was no collective appetite for that, because in the end, I think the task we had set ourselves was beyond even the wisdom of Solomon. And I agree with Harlan. The terrible thing is that we probably knew that as early as 2003. So I think events will drive what we do next in Afghanistan, but at the moment, confidence in the US as an ally has taken a hit. NATO and the political and moral credibility of the EU is damaged. The void we have left will be filled by others, China, Iran, Russia, who deal with governments without preconditions. Can we blame the collapse on the failure of the Afghan political leadership? Yes. Our faith in their leadership had evaporated, just as our fed-upness with their corruption had driven us mad. There are those who are asking whether, this has exposed the delusions of Western power and the end of liberal interventionism. They're asking if nations will be seeking security guarantees elsewhere. And they're asking if our model for capacity building, driven perhaps by commercial interests rather than the need of Afghanistan, is partly responsible for our failure. And they're asking if the terror threat to the West is now bigger. I think the answer are yes, 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 and yes. So what do we do? Well, I think at the moment the US, NATO look weak, and Russia will push the boundaries further to challenge and undermine our values. And I repeat the message that I've made earlier in this forum. I think NATO and the allies now need to get their collective act together. I think they have a framework all set out very clearly in the Brussels communique about what it is they need to do. And I think if we can deliver that, then it will put us back on the path to finding our mojo and our purpose. And that's what we need to do. Thank you.
Thank you for that advice as well. Not only a summary of the situation, but also good advice for NATO. Let's switch to European Union. I mean, our forte in NATO is that we are allied for defense and security. Our forte in the European Union is that we are allied for economic prosperity and social development. Right now we are hearing about, and not only now, this talk has begun earlier, but it appears that it gained momentum, the discussion about the European strategic autonomy. So how is this, and what should we expect of the EU going further after the fall of Afghanistan?
I'm still on red? Okay. Thank you very much, Antonia, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And let me take this opportunity to thank the NSC for having asked me to take part in this event. I think we are still digesting the Afghanistan debacle in Europe. The main thing we're actually talking about, of course, is refugees. It's only suddenly occurred to a lot of Europeans that Afghanistan is actually much closer to the EU than to the US. And in our traditional, rather haphazard and messy way, we are above all now trying to see how many refugees we take in and on what conditions. But looking beyond that, I think I'd very briefly like to mention two other parts of the European debate. The first refers to America. My friend and colleague Jeremy Shapiro recently wrote that we need to wake up and smell the coffee of this post-American world. Maybe that's a little bit too dramatic, but it's questions about the US and its role and its relationship with Europe, of course, are going to be very much on our minds. In particular, of course, in the run-up to the next NATO summit in Madrid next year. As far as the EU is concerned, well, someone I admire greatly, HRVP, High Representative and Vice President of the Commission, Josep Borrell, immediately wrote an op-ed basically saying that the answer to the EU's dilemmas is, as you mentioned, strategic autonomy. Now, strategic autonomy is an old concept. It was coined back in 2016. It was very vague initially. I think, interestingly, the pandemic has given it a bit more flesh, a bit more meat, because we're now applying it to a very broad array of policies. We're applying it to technological and industrial autonomy. But as far as Afghanistan is concerned, I think the big question it raises is essentially, first of all, what went wrong in the distribution of labor between the US and its European allies? And secondly, can a beefed up European foreign policy and security identity really prevent this from happening again? Very briefly, I would argue that Afghanistan revealed three strategic autonomy deficits from a European perspective: information, decision, and action. All of these elements were basically determined by the US, and the European partners really didn't have much of a say in this. So specifically, Borrell has proposed, for example, that in the forthcoming European Strategic Compass, which we will be adopting in the spring of next year, this should include the creation of a 5,000 strong initial entry force. So the idea is that there would be a sort of mini European army, consisting only, though, of 5,000 troops, which is a rather meager figure, which would be immediately available to deal with urgent crises. Now, this is it's a good idea. It's long overdue. Sadly, though, it rather reminds us of the old battle groups idea, which were never really implemented. But in any case, as the previous speakers were hinting at, the real problem is what comes next. Okay, maybe we can deploy this initial entry force, but the real question to my mind is, will Europeans be able to stomach limited but sustained engagement? And for me, the litmus test here will be the Sahel. What is going to happen in the Sahel? And of course, our French friends and colleagues will be bearing the main brunt of that. The Sahel operation is not going well. Like the Afghanistan experiment, it shows the difficulties involved in what we normally call nation building, but should probably really call state building. And in fact, France is already announcing that it wants to wind this down. So sadly, my conclusion is rather pessimistic. Yes, there is talk of more strategic autonomy, but it is actually unlikely that in the short term at least, this will solve most of the dilemmas that the European Union is facing on this front. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for bringing up the next challenges that we might have to face soon, the Sahel. With that in mind, but not only with that, Mr. Ambassador, you have been in the neighborhood of Afghanistan, and probably most recent than most of us here. Could you give us a picture of how do you see Afghanistan evolving next, and how do you see the neighborhood also evolving as the Afghanistan crisis unfolds to the next level?
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me anyway. For the, I would like to first of all try to make a sort of more broader image of the situation. Is that the hastily withdrawal of the Allied troops from Kabul will have incalculable geopolitical consequences, and also, of course, with the neighborhood of Afghanistan, and more precisely with the Central Asian countries. That is also, of course, a sort of direct threat to the stability of this region, and also to what concerns Russia, of course. But just about geopolitical consequences as for the United States, even if for the NATO State Secretary General, the decision to end US involvement in Afghanistan did not fatally undermine European faith in the United States as a global leader, the trust in the US leadership seems to be depreciated among allies and more generally in the world. And the US strategic credibility are strongly affected. The results that is the Western alliance shaken up. And the third point, the withdrawal opens the path to some other powers that don't necessarily share Western values. Allow me to quote the former French Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Hubert Védrine. He says, Afghanistan is a tomb of humanitarian intervention. Usually we speak as Afghanistan as a tomb of empires, but here speaking more about humanitarian intervention, what we call in French the droit d'ingérence. The West has not any more monopoly of power and influence. We are faced with numerous revisionist forces that want to take their revenge, like China. If the world is not longer run by the West, it is not either by China. In this multipolarity, we are also faced with the rise of power of other powers. And he concludes saying that on 200 countries present at the UN, there is about 15 powers today that lead their own strategy. More precisely for China, the withdrawal from Kabul could signify for them, for betting a US weakening, that could allow testing Washington's determination to defend Taiwan. But of course, the danger here is that the US weakness should not be over-interpreted by some countries or groups. Another long-term consequences of the US defeat could be a loss of influence, not just in Afghanistan, but across the Middle East, including Iraq and even Saudi Arabia. Iraq recently has gathered a regional conference to ease tensions in the region and encourage cooperation between the neighboring countries, in bracket, without foreign interference. That means clearly without the United States. The new Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi, the President Erdogan and King Salman were invited, and they participated to this gathering. And the French President, by the way, also was invited to this meeting. In Afghanistan itself, could we trust the Taliban when they assure that Afghanistan will not host terrorist groups that may threaten the US or Europe? The Kabul airport attack and also the present situation in human rights and especially for women and girls shows that at the moment this is not the case. A lot depends on how the Taliban will be able to control the territory and their own troops. Here we can only recall the terms of the G7 leader statement of Afghanistan adopted on August 24th, saying we will judge the Afghan parties by their action, not words. In particular, we reaffirm that the Taliban will be held accountable for their action on preventing terrorism, on human rights, in particular those of women, girls and minorities, and on pursuing an inclusive political settlement in Afghanistan. And my second point and last point, what lesson for the EU? After the chaotic Trump presidency, the US messy withdrawal should be a second wake-up call for the Europeans. The NATO Secretary General Mr. Jens Stoltenberg told the debacle should prompt the alliance to reorient its focus onto core European issues closer to home. That means that the EU will have a difficult choice, either think that it is useless for its member states to become engaged in these missions, considering having fewer resources than the US, or to start thinking of itself strategically as a geopolitical power, as a European pillar of the alliance. To conclude, the reflection in the EU about the future of European defense is already very much advanced, engaged. Many initiatives have been launched, like Permanent Structured Cooperation, PESCO, the European Defence Fund, the EDF, and the Coordinated Annual Review of Defence, CARD. The current task would be to knit more strongly the evolving processes and deepen defence cooperation to the existing NATO frameworks. As often is being said, Europeans have to assume more responsibility for their security and behave independently if needed. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much for that too. Thank you, and with thinking about Europe and its more independent view, within the alliance, I assume, the NATO alliance, I'd like to hear your opinion, Mr. Yeşiltaş. You are also not only representing a Turkish think tank, but also deal with research that regards the Middle East. So you understand very well the area. That said, what are the challenges that Turkey sees? And what are the opportunities considering the crisis? I mean, we want to stay optimistic, at least at the very end of the first round of questions.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank you, New Strategy Center, for inviting me to this important security forum. Yes, there are opportunities as well as challenges for Turkey. First of all, we have to underline the determinants of Turkish foreign policy towards Afghanistan, because it's common to speak about the historical tie and relationship between Turkey and Afghanistan in a very positive way, not only in Turkey but also in Afghanistan. Even Taliban is talking about the historical relationship between Turkey and Afghanistan. So therefore, this historical context is really important to make sense about Turkish foreign policy towards Afghanistan. Secondly, the Muslim identity of Turkey and Afghanistan, Islamic identity is another common sense. This does not necessarily mean that Turkey shares the same, or the public in Turkey or the different segments of society share the same idea about or the same interpretation about the Islam with Taliban. It does not necessarily mean so, but this common identity can play a facilitator role to make a relationship with new Afghanistan under Taliban rule. So another important factor to understand Turkey's foreign policy towards Afghanistan and the perception of Turkey in Afghanistan is Turkey's NATO mission. This is, I think, important because this mission is providing Turkey is a very positive image in the eyes of Afghan society. In keeping with this stance, Turkey did not assume any combat role. Its 20-year mission as part of NATO mission in Afghanistan and rejected any request from the coalition that would assist him in conducting military operation in Afghanistan. So therefore, these are the main determinants. Of course, Turkey wants to play a geopolitical role. Turkey sees Afghanistan another window of opportunity to show its diplomatic and military activism. But under the Taliban rule, Turkey, of course, will play a diplomatic role rather than playing a military role because of the perception of Taliban not only against Turkey but also against any foreign military troop in Afghanistan. So therefore, this geopolitical role is important. But of course, Turkey has many challenges. In Afghanistan. First of all, refugee flux is one of the important concerns for Turkey, since Turkey now is hosting more than 5 million refugees, especially coming from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. We have, I think, more than 3,100 refugees from Afghanistan, and therefore this is a really important issue for Turkey. It is also a very strong public awareness, which is not positive towards the Afghanistan refugee and political atmosphere in Turkey is really strong, is really against the another refugee mobilization from Afghanistan. So another challenge is really important, in which Turkey has been struggling to find a comprehensive solution against the terrorism issue. As you know, Syria is one of the important conflict domain for Turkey. Turkey has been struggling to fight against terrorism, and especially as part of the Syrian crisis, Idlib is another important problem that we can directly connect with the terrorism issue in Afghanistan. There are many different groups who came from Afghanistan, many foreign terrorist fighters, which can directly affect Turkey's security landscape in Idlib as well as inside Turkey. So therefore, terrorism is really important strategic challenge for Turkey, which need to, carefully follow. Of course, there is also a challenge against Turkey's economic investment in Afghanistan. Turkey is one of the important countries which has been investing in economy in Afghanistan. So therefore, the new government, the new Afghanistan under the rule of Taliban, Nobody knows how Turkey's investment will continue and what kind of agreement that Turkey and Taliban will reach. What about the current situation? Unfortunately, the run of the airport, international Hamid Karzai International Airport, the negotiation failed because of the many disagreements. Probably Taliban demanded recognition, political recognition from Turkey, in which Turkey is not ready, because Turkey is probably follow the same path with the European Union and NATO partners. There are some possibilities about Turkey's different position compared to the NATO and European Union countries, but still Turkey is eager to follow the same path with the European Unions and other international actors. Another important reasons behind the failure of the negotiation is the demand of Taliban to gain a kind of political office in Istanbul, which is another important point that will continue to discuss with both parties. There are some opportunities, especially in terms of the cooperation between Turkey, Pakistan, and Qatar. There is a possibility that Turkey and Qatar can run the international Hamid Karzai airports if the negotiation will continue. Of course, all Turkey's efforts to contribute to the Afghanistan crisis depends on how Taliban will establish their government. It depends on the alternatives. If Taliban choose to maintain the peace process and political roadmap, then Turkey can play a facilitator role, not only in terms of running the international Hamid Karzai airport, but also facilitating and mediating the political process in Afghanistan, because we know that Turkey has also soft power instrument over different ethnic and religious groups in Afghanistan. This will help Turkey's contribution, and this will help also peace and political process in Afghanistan. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for that overview of what Turkey can and what Turkey could do, plus some vision on the regional aspects as well. When I say regional, of course, I refer to Eastern Mediterranean, Middle Eastern region. And before I give the floor to the public, because we've heard about the U.S. being focused internally nowadays. We've heard about the idea that we failed in Afghanistan, at least in the perception of the public, we as NATO, we as Europeans, at least in the very beginning of the withdrawal process. We've heard about the idea of a more independent Europe within the alliance. We've also heard about what Turkey can do, Turkey as a NATO member, but also as a player in the region. So with that, I'd like to ask a question for all of you and take each your view on it. What is the next crisis that we are going to stick together as an alliance? Because we are seeing a vacuum of power in Central Asia coming up. We are seeing a slow withdrawal of the U.S. towards its home affairs, which is rather normal, and it's been the strategy for quite a while. We are also seeing a refocus within NATO even, and Europe towards the Asia Pacific, and a lot of holes, the Sahel. I could also remind us that we are in the Black Sea area, which is an interesting area for such a discussion. The Balkans are nearby as well. So which do you think will be the next turning point where we are going to have to stick together as an alliance, the US and Europe, And what's the crisis? What's the theater?
Ready?
Ready.
Antonia, that's the best question that's been asked at this conference for 2 days, and I congratulate you on that. I'm serious. The answer is there's not going to be one. The alliance will stick together because it has to. And what we will see are centrifugal forces that will try to take the alliance in different directions, but there'll be a certain gravity. And the real problem is that the real issues we face, I mean, Russia and China, I believe, are less threats than we think because we don't understand their weaknesses and we don't focus on those weaknesses. But what's happening in America right now, which is representative, you've got climate change. This is catastrophic. Catastrophic. We've got COVID. You may not know this, but we're getting 200,000 infections a day and 2,000 deaths. And so you're going to have all these issues of massive acts of disruption, whether it's climate change, whether it's cyber, whether it's social media. NATO is incapable of addressing these issues because it's still primarily a military alliance. The EU is not going to be able to address these issues where it should. The UN can't, and so nations are going to have to come together, as Donald Rumsfeld famously said, coalitions of the willing. And I think that's what we're going to see in NATO and elsewhere. We're going to have to build various coalitions that will be structured depending upon each of the particular crises. But I don't see any international organization that's going to be sufficiently able to deal with it simply because of their charters and simply because of the different contradictions. Having said that, I do think that coalitions of the willing will become quite successful. And as John Maynard Keynes said, whenever we get into economic problems, some technology will come along to save us. And I think some technologies will come along. We saw what happened with the COVID vaccine, which was invented in 3 days. 3 days. Of course, it took 6 months to test it. And there'll be new things. You have more information being invented every day than existed in nature. So I think there's going to be a certain stability, even though there's no lack of organization that would seem to ensure that. There's going to be some kind of an Einsteinian principle, theory of relativity, of universal relativity, that I think will be able to maintain some sense of stability.
Thank you for that fresh, optimistic view of the day. Sir Everard?
I think since 2001, the West has faced, in my count, 11 strategic shocks, COVID and the retreat from Afghanistan being the last two. I think the compound effect has been to weaken the West. I think it's led to a loss of faith in liberal democracy. I think it's led to a loss of faith in government. And I think it's led to a loss of faith in some of the big multilateral institutions that have served us so well since the end of the Cold War. And so I think, that the challenge is going to be one of leadership and finding a path that moves us forward from a pretty low point.
Okay. The microphone. This is the technology, the next technology available that's going to save the world, hopefully, with me not pushing the button where it should. Thank you for that leadership keyword. Mr. Powell?
Thank you, Antonia. Your question suggested that your main concern is the continued viability of the Atlantic Alliance and some kind of Euro-American fundamental understanding. And I just wanted to go back very quickly to a point, and that is that, again, Jeremy Shapiro has recently said that we need to realize that America has finally become a normal country. America no longer wants to be the policeman of the world. I think the more important point is that Biden is the third American president who has told us this, and we just simply didn't want to listen or accept it. Obama said this, Trump said this, and Biden has said this. So if this is the case, I think in future the US will continue to work with its allies, of course it will, and certainly within the NATO structure. But essentially when its vital interests are at stake, and its vital interests will increasingly be dominated by its rivalry with China. My concern is, do those vital interests include Ukraine? Do they include Belarus? Do they include the Middle East? Do they include the Sahel? And I think the answer to that is perhaps less clear. But you know, the real threat, I think, to all of us is one that hasn't been mentioned here specifically, and that is the weakening of representative democracy in our Western societies. You know, the alliance, European integration, none of those really make sense if the future of democracy is in peril. How credible is the European Union, frankly, as a global actor, as a democracy-promoting actor, when we are actually incapable of making sure that our own member states observe the rule of law and basic democratic practices? And I'm referring, of course, to the governments of countries like Poland and Hungary. How credible is the US as a democracy promoter after the events on Capitol Hill back in January? So I think, frankly, this is our real problem. You know, resilience has to begin at home, and I'm talking basically about democratic resilience. Thank you.
Resilience, which is first of all democratic, and hopefully this will deal with our work together, but also individually within the alliance. That's what I got from your answer. Thank you. Mr. Ambassador, Excellency.
Thank you very much. I think that, yes, the withdrawal of the Allied troop, and the US was Allied troop from Afghanistan, has already created a vacuum of power, especially in the Central Asia. And it's a direct threat to the stability of the region, and especially the stability of the weakest states as Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. And don't forget that Tajikistan has a very, very long border with Afghanistan, 1,200 kilometers. And it's difficult to control, of course, even if there are some Russian troops there. But it's also a sort of possibility for Russia and for China, which powers that don't necessarily share the Western values, to come and to fill this new vacuum. About Sahel, just one or two words about the Sahel. Yes, the President Macron has announced that France will, I don't remember exactly the word, sort of reorientation of the French presence there. That means also that it will be some specialized, maybe action, military action, more focus on intelligence, etc. And about new challenge, and of course I join the idea and what said Mr. Powell, that the new challenge are there as COVID, as climate change, and the general. So yes, and that really question everybody, all the world, being the United States, West, and China, and Russia, etc. That is my point. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, challenges overboard and specific answers to specific crises. Mr. Yeşiltaş, please.
Okay, I think the real problem is about the current structure of international system, which can be defined as transition periods, which is also defined as interregnum, which means that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. I think this is the main problem about the international system. There are three levels that we have to underline. The first layers or level is international and systemic level, in which the United States and China is competing against each other. But the real question here is that can China rise peacefully if the Western strategic dominance will change? The second one is is about the regional level. There are many different regional security complex all around the world under the international system. While when you look at the Middle Eastern security architecture, it has been changing. It has been transforming since the Arab Spring, which ultimately shape other regional security complex, for example, Europe. So the final one is the national level. We have many weak states, failed states, and collapsed states, especially in the post-pandemic world. I think these states will be one of the important challenges for international system and stability for the international system. Consequently, all these different challenges lead to emergency of global anxiety in different levels, in individual levels, societal levels, state levels, and international levels. So we have many anxieties about the international system.
And this is where the question originated, actually, the anxiety of what's next. So yes, a rebuild, hopefully, of the world, and the international system will tell us where to work together. With that hope and conclusion, I would like to give the floor to you, and I'll be standing by to make sure that these gentlemen respond and answer your questions. So who wants to take the floor? Sir.
Good morning, Major General Bedell, Land Forces Chief. First of all, I think this was a subject very hot and temperature-wise for the chilly morning in Bucharest. It did wake us up, but being a force generator and contributor to so many operations, not just Afghanistan, but also Iraq, I'm also responsible to get the charisma of the soldier to the right point in the perception of its own public. And I would ask the panel for what's the positive, or what are some of the positive factors that we go back to the citizen and tell, hey, maybe operations like this train us better for crisis management. Maybe we have better interoperability. Maybe command and control is much better integrated on the alliance. What would be your perspective for one or two factors that we can go back to the public and say, it's not everything bad. Look, we also have some of the pluses. Thank you so much.
JJ, I think Simona Kocikora gave that answer beautifully yesterday. This has really turned your country into a serious player. You fought above your weight class. You did admirably and honorably. You went to war before you were members of NATO. I think you just draft what she said and put it on television, because it was a magnificent and I think correct definition of how this country has, and I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, has matured dramatically. And even though the experience did not end well for many people, it ended very well for what it has done to make Romania a really serious player.
I think there's a wonderful contradiction, isn't there, that in general our public didn't like the campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan, but actually their admiration for the service and sacrifice of our soldiers is extremely high. And I worry that as we look to the future, our governments become overcautious in the use of military power. It works if you're bold. And we have young men and women who like doing this sort of stuff, and you need to give them free rein. And so I think, it comes back to educating our public. We've had a big theme on this conference. We need to educate our public on the true nature of the threat, cyber, hybrid, all these things. And also, I think, better educate our public on the utility of force.
Yes, very briefly. From a Spanish perspective, for example, the popularity of the armed forces is at an all-time high, and this has a lot to do with the performance of the armed forces in campaigns such as the Afghanistan campaign. And although it's true that many pundits will tell us that the way in which we disengaged was, underwhelming, nevertheless, interestingly, public opinion has responded very positively to the role of individual army officers, military personnel generally, the very selfless manner in which they've behaved in the last few weeks and months of their presence in Afghanistan. So I'm at least relieved to see that, first of all, in Spain at least, veterans are proud of what they've done, and there doesn't seem to be too much soul-searching about whether this was worthwhile or not. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, politicians, even those who were unenthusiastic about the war, have not been trying to gain any political capital out of this. So in terms of what has just been mentioned, in terms of military careers as attractive careers for young people and so on, I think Afghanistan won't have a lasting negative impact. Thank you.
Just to say one of the answer, maybe it's a more participation of the EU member states in reinforced European defense, and that is, I think, important. And about this, I am quite optimistic. Thank you.
Someone else has a question? Mr. Mureșan and Robert.
Thank you so much. First, I wonder why it's not discussed the problem of the nexus, corruption, organized crime, and terrorism in Afghanistan, because organized crime is based on production of drugs, trafficking of drugs is a driving force of the economy, and it's financing the activities also of the Taliban. So why is absent the discussion about organized crime in Afghanistan? Second, for our Turkish colleague, I have the feeling, maybe I'm wrong, that Turkey is not only part of the solution, but also part of the problem. Because you are a member of NATO, you want to be a member of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, you have your own agenda. I want to know how solid it's Turkey economical, financial, to do these big games without support from Qatar and other countries. And second, how strong is the support of the Turkish army after the tragic events you had some years ago? Thank you so much.
Let's take the next question from Robert, and we will keep this in mind so that we keep the time as well.
Okay, thank you so much. Robert Lupizzo with Cale Europeană. I have a question for all the panelists. Actually, it's a dual question. First of all, this withdrawal from Afghanistan, which changes the game in the bigger strategic environment of competition, is it a signal of US retrenchment as a new doctrine? And what's your take on that? And finally, America's longest war has been also NATO's most enduring operation since its founding. What lies ahead now for NATO from your point of view with further challenges? Where will NATO go? Thank you so much.
So, why no talk on organized crime?
That's self-evident.
Go ahead.
No, I mean, I think the Turkish question is really the more interesting one.
We all want to hear that
really
one, huh?
Good, yeah.
Okay.
That's why we paid the big bucks to come here.
Let's hear it.
Okay, thank you for your question. First of all, about Shanghai Cooperation, it's not a strategic choice for Turkey. You know, it was emerged as not as an alternative to the European Union. First of all, I think there are many misunderstandings about Turkey's position vis-à-vis Shanghai Cooperation Organization, because Turkey still perceives itself as a strategic partner for European Union and NATO, so it doesn't make sense for me, Turkey's membership to Shanghai Cooperation Organization in terms of normative aspect of the European Union and in terms of the strategic consequences for Turkey. It was a kind of political options that Turkey would have been a kind of observer or observatory position in Shanghai Cooperation. So this is not a strategic alternative, and it was not a real discussion in Turkey. About Turkish army, so therefore Turkey is not a part of the problem for NATO or European Union in terms of its strategic preference about Russia or other non-European, non-NATO countries. So about Turkish army, I think, yes, the failed military coup attempt was a strategic turning point for Turkey, but not a negative way, but very, very positive way. Turkey, after the, military coup attempt, Turkey carried out its first military operation in Syria. It was the first NATO country on the ground in the fight against ISIS. So in terms of its military capacity, still Turkey is the second army in the NATO alliance. In terms of its combat effectiveness, Turkey is, I think, now fighting and militarily operating in different fronts, including Libya, Syria, and Iraq. So in terms of its, military industrial complex, Turkey is still really active. Especially following the failed military coup attempt, security sector reform, especially in the Turkish military, was another strategic step taken from Turkish government to, make Turkish army ready. So therefore, I don't agree with you that Turkey, military, after the military coup is weak in terms of, many different aspects.
The answer to the second question, the two questions, no, the United States is not withdrawing. How many troops does the United States have stationed now in the Middle East, Korea, Japan, Europe, and elsewhere? They are not coming home. Second, this is a great opportunity for NATO because NATO has the chance here to reevaluate and seize this time. And from what I saw from the new chairman of the NATO Military Committee, we could not have a better person to really innovate and to energize NATO. But if we seize this as an opportunity to do something, instead of go through the bureaucratic nonsense that's been one of the problems of NATO, NATO can emerge even stronger if, as Sir James says, we have the leadership to do that.
Yes, and of course, the NATO mantra of in together, out together, actually when we look back, the Allies were remarkably cohesive over a 20-year period in Afghanistan, and we should celebrate that.
Yes, 2 words or 3 words about the corruption and drug trafficking in Afghanistan. I think that is one of the maybe of the biggest problem and a reason of the withdrawal of NATO from this country. But also these phenomena are touching very and from a long time the Central Asia as well. Actually, the economy of, for instance, of certain of these countries is based on drug trafficking very, very heavily. And there are already, and for a long time now, sort of narco states, you see. And that is the biggest problem for Russia, of course, the traffic, but for Europe too. And I think for US maybe also. That is also one of the future, actual, present problem, past and future. Thank you.
Anyone else wants to? Yeah. Okay. So we pass on to the next question from the audience, that I believe will be the last question. Anyone?
People vying to be the last questioner. You can hardly hold them back.
Yep. Okay, so it appears that we are done and we can move on to our break. Not before telling you that at 9:45 there will be the next panel, which will have the Romanian Foreign Minister Bogdan Aurescu and the Croatian Foreign Minister Gordan Grilic-Radman coming together on the podium and speaking at this conference. Okay, only the Romanian Foreign Minister will be on the podium. The Croatian Foreign Minister will be on top of the podium on television. Clarify that. Thank you very much, everyone.